Welcome back. My name is Sam Hassel, and in today's episode, we are going to be covering three of the fundamental signals that you want to be sending to top colleges in terms of your candidacy, and the three signals that they're basically looking for that are extremely important. And these have consequences for how you go about building your candidacy in some respects, but I think it also just sheds light in terms of what these colleges are, what they're really looking for. Before we get into that, I just want to remind everyone that going forward, we will be uploading these episodes. If you have been tuning in on Apple Podcasts or Spotify, we're going to be uploading the episodes to YouTube as well. So if you want to tune in on that platform as well, or alternatively to the podcasts, the audio versions, you can do so going forward. You can look us up. It will be under the YouTube account Great Minds Advising, and you'll be able to watch there as well. Okay, so let's dive in. So, what are these signals that top colleges are looking for? And why do they really matter in terms of how we're going about building different parts of our candidacy? So, this was something that I was thinking about recently in the context of our most recent episode, which was how many times you should take the SAT. And if we were sort of imagining some different signals that could be sent, one signal that you might be trying to send the top colleges is, I'm a very gritty, perseverant student. You basically would send them a whole bunch of test scores. It would potentially be to your detriment to only send them one test sitting, that you sort of just knocked out of the park because you didn't really have an opportunity to sort of show them how gritty you are. I could grind my way from a 1380 up to a 1560, and so there's that sort of world, right? One in which the signal that you're trying to send is basically, I have this maximum grit. I have a super, hardcore work ethic, and look at me, I sort of started all the way down here, and but I still got basically to the same place as a whole bunch of other kids who maybe started ahead of me, right? And that could actually be a very compelling signal to send to these top colleges, right? We know it's very important in life, right? Just if you could keep getting better, 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 your starting point might be behind a whole bunch of other people. But the person who keeps getting 1% better, 1% better, 1% better, basically it never stops. They just keep improving. They can pass by a lot of people in life who maybe started ahead of them. Then there's the other situation whereby a student who just submitted one score of 1580, for example, on the SAT or 35, 36 on the ACT, that's what's actually valued, right? And in that situation, what would you basically be signaling? You would basically be signaling this sort of like almost like nonchalance or lack of effort, or it comes very easily, or I just sort of, I'm naturally very intelligent, I naturally have very high aptitude. And so there's two possible signals here, and both of them on their surface could be compelling on their own terms, right? And so what we discussed in the most recent episode was you want to take the test as many times as basically you need to in order to hit the optimal score, but you don't actually want to present that to the colleges, right? And so that basically signaled that what is actually valued by the top colleges more in this particular context, not in all contexts or not in all parts of your candidacy, but in this particular context with standardized testing, what you do want to signal or optimize for more is basically the signal of, very high aptitude, very high sort of, more like intellectual giftedness, or this comes to you a lot more easily, right? And there's going to be a reason why that's the optimal signal, and why the grit and the perseverance, although very important and a signal that colleges do also want to see, why this isn't the place that they necessarily want to see it, right? And so I want to sort of lay out here three fundamental signs of promise that these colleges are trying to identify. And I want to use an accompanying visual as well. So, what these colleges essentially are after, and there's a whole bunch of different, we could go into seven, nine, a whole bunch of different traits, right? And these traits, what they are looking for, right? There are some things that are just accidental to the admissions process, right? Like early decision, yield protection, rejecting an overqualified but undercommitted applicant, right? In the regular decision round, for example, right? There are things that are just peculiar to admissions and the game of admissions, and they don't really have much to do with life, particularly. You could say the ED concept or the notion of sort of putting in a binding commitment or sort of committing, if you were applying to jobs, or if you're talking about relationships, like you could say that commitment is very important and it's a very important signal to send. And so it does actually apply to other domains as well. A workplace may not want to hire you if they think you have very low intent of actually accepting a job offer. So actually, even some of the things that are peculiar to admissions, in terms of maybe not predicting life success per se, are still actually very domain general and are broadly applicable a whole range of other domains. But the main thing that I'm sort of homing in on here is what are predictors of success? And so putting in an ED is not really like a predictor of life success, right? That is something that's quite peculiar to just the admissions process. But at a fundamental level, and I think a lot of people they don't they don't quite understand this or appreciate it. It's almost like very frustrating, particularly in talking to certain students or families where all they're chasing is just the prestige of the name brand college. It's all about going to an Ivy League school. And they don't understand that a lot of the value of getting into one of those schools derives from the fact that these schools are already selecting for traits that are already very well known to predict life success in the first place, right? And so a lot of people are viewing these colleges through the prism of I have to go here because, this is gonna make my life way better, and they're viewing them as almost like major developmental institutions, right? Whereas a lot of what actually highly correlates people being successful who've gone to these colleges is the underlying traits and substrates and characteristics of the people who get into these colleges because they are already very well known and already very well empirically studied and researched and known to already predict success in the first place. A lot of people are looking at these colleges for more of the sort of institutional development and the networking. There's definitely things to be said for that. Being in a very, intellectually rich community, being surrounded by other great minds, being around other people who want to tackle very difficult challenges. That is a very conducive, useful atmosphere, and there's certainly a lot of benefits of being in those types of forums, and there are networking effects, etc., etc. But a lot of it simply derives the success of the people who go to a lot of these top colleges derives from the fact that they already have traits that are known to predict success in the first place. What are some of these traits, right? What are some of these traits that basically, instead of being so oriented around what you get, this is one of my favorite sayings, it's not about what you get in life, it's about who you need to become along the way in order to get it. Who are you trying to become? What person are you trying to become in terms of these critical traits that both would predict success in terms of getting into these top colleges, but on top of that, just happen to predict success in life. We could go 7 traits deep, we could go 9 traits deep, or 7 signals, 9 signals deep, but I wanna really isolate 3 of them. And so the 3 that I'm gonna isolate here, because I think we sort of get our biggest bang for our buck in terms of just these 3 without going into, a dozen or so. Number 1, core aptitude, right? So that is just the student possesses some raw horsepower, particularly intellectual horsepower, right? But there is some raw foundation of intelligence there, or call it whatever you want. If you don't want to call it intelligence, you call it, propensity for academic achievement, some raw giftedness, some raw talent. But there's something at a fundamental level there, right? If we were talking about athletes, you're not going to be an exceptional basketball player unless you have some raw ability, right? Now, can you overcome it through work ethic and, other traits? Sure, but you're not going to be the best. the person who's going to be the best is going to have a whole bunch of things stacked on top of each other, and one of them just going to be raw ability, right? And so the first signal that you're trying to convey to these colleges is you just have the raw horsepower, right? And where does that signal come from, right? That signal primarily comes from your academic index, right? So it comes from things like your ability to handle a high degree of course rigor, very challenging courses, your ability to get very good grades in those courses, potentially your class rank to some extent, and then standardized testing. If what we're trying to convey in terms of the signal is basically raw aptitude, raw horsepower, then you showing the college that you had to take the SAT 14 times to hit a 1550 is not actually it's a misplaced signal, right? What you would be signaling there is your grit or your perseverance, but they're not looking at your SAT scores for that signal. It's the wrong domain. That domain, the SAT score or ACT score, or your grades, etc. They're looking at that for just raw horsepower. They don't really want to know that you struggled a lot, right? And this also comes into play in terms of teacher recs. So a lot of teachers will have a question in their little sheets that they hand out each year, usually towards the spring. Hopefully, they give out a sheet. Some teachers don't give out a sheet at all. And if they don't give out a sheet, you better give them a sheet yourself so that they write you an excellent letter filled with great anecdotes and very specific details because they're going to forget. But in those sheets, a lot of teachers have a question such as, what was your biggest struggle in this class? And that is a really terrible question for a rec questionnaire. But a lot of students are more than happy to volunteer what they struggled in the class, or there was a topic, or, maybe I didn't have a good first quarter grade. And the college would never know because they only see your final year, your end of year grades. They would never even know that maybe you had a 3, 4 in the class in first quarter, but by the end of the year, you pulled it up. But now, because you volunteer that information in the letter and the teacher mentions, oh, look at Bobby, he started at a 3.4, but he pulled it up. It can actually hurt your candidacy, right? And the reason it can hurt your candidacy is this is not the place to be signaling your perseverance or your determination or your grit. It's not that those things aren't valued by the top colleges, they are, right? It's just not the correct forum to be sending that signal, right? And so we're talking about things like SAT and ACT scores. By all means, take it as many times as you need to. But when it comes to actually, what you're showing to the colleges, you have to be very careful in terms of the signal. Now, I personally think that somebody who can get to a 1500, but they need to really grind and take the test another 7 times to get to a 1550 or 1560. I still think that that's very compelling. You got to a 1500, really good score, but now you got to take it a whole bunch more to basically to grind out those last incremental points to put yourself in a really competitive position. And that is a lot of what greatness demands in life, right? It's somebody who is okay, great, you're 99th percentile, but you need to be 99.9th percentile. You need to be 99.99th percentile. You need to be 99.999th percentile, right? And a lot of people who are the best in any given field, they are absolutely obsessive and they will just most other people will just say, "Hey, this is good enough. You're crazy." And that's what makes them different, right? Is people they don't see these little tiny nuances, right? Or they don't think that they matter. And the person who's just, a gifted musician, a gifted artist, an obsessive person like Steve Jobs, right? Will pick up on these little things and they will just grind them out. And so I don't have any problem with it, right? I think that a student who is willing to take the test as many times as they possibly, as they have to do the most for their candidacy, I think that's totally fine. And I think it's very predictive of life success. But you do have to sort of be aware of the optics and where admissions officers are looking for certain signals in certain contexts and where they don't want a given signal in a given context. So when it comes to the first signal that you're trying to fundamentally send, and this is the one that I think a lot of people know the most and they associate the most with admissions is just intellectual horsepower, raw horsepower, academic promise, right? And so again, that's going to be your course rigor, your grades, your SAT and your ACT. That's the signal that you're really trying to send, and these are the means by which you send that signal. And you're not trying to show that you really struggled in Calc BC, but you brought the grade up, or you only got a B. And that's not. You're not trying to signal that in these areas. It should basically, in an ideal world, come as easily, or come as easy to you as it possibly can. There are other signals, right, that we need to send as well because they're also highly predictive of success. So one signal, one predictor of success will just be basically your sheer aptitude, your sheer talent, right? That could be in athletics, it could be in music. It's just your innate ability, right? It doesn't mean that you can't have other things like work ethic that can compensate, but these admissions officers, these top colleges, they want it all, right? They want to have the highest possible predictive power of success. And so it's not an either or, it's a both end, right? So that now brings us to some of the other signals. So now it's time for the signal we were discussing before, which is basically grit, perseverance, ability to work through challenge, to work through difficulty, overcome, very trying circumstances. And this is a second extremely important signal because it's an extremely important signal in life if you're talking about success. How gritty are you? How perseverant are you? Right? You might be extremely talented, but somebody who's extremely talented and they're extremely dogged and gritty will beat the person who's just one of those two things, right? Or none of them. So it is, again, it's a both and, it's not an either or, right? And a lot of people are in this very like either or mindset. I think the dean of admissions at Duke, the longtime dean, um, really had one of the best quotes in admissions where he said, we have so many smart applicants that we have the privilege of taking not only the students who are smart, but also the students who are interesting as well. Right. And so it's not a matter of, sure, if you're smart, you can beat the dumb people. And if you're interesting, you can beat the boring people. But the person who's going to beat everybody is the person who's smart and interesting. Right. And there are a lot of very smart kids who are not interesting, right? And these colleges have so many smart kids that once they've first identified the really smart kids, the kids who have the academic potential and promise based on all of these metrics, etc., in their applications, they then can say, well, we are left with still a ton of smart kids. Let's pick the smart kids who are also really unique and interesting and compelling. And so it's not an either or, it's a both end. Right. And so it's not a matter of do you just have the innate potential, but on top of that, can you also stack exceptional grit and perseverance? The place for this is not in, at least in terms of what you present to the colleges, is not showing them, hey, let me submit 14 SAT scores, or let me have my teacher in their recommendation volunteer how hard Calc BC was for me and how much of a struggle it was for me to get that, to get that 4.0 that I had to eventually sort of bring it up at the end of the year, but I had to do it, via tutoring and office hours, and I started the year lower, and, I needed a million different resources to do it. That's not what you're trying to signal, right? That's the wrong place to be sending that signal. But where you do want to potentially be sending that signal is through the rest of your candidacy, your resume building. I mentioned in one of our videos, we had a student who she was doing research over the summer, and the professor was, not really helping her very much. And she was in the lab until 9, 10 p.m. at night, working 12-hour days, commuting all the way down to New York City and then all the way back home again. She was basically teaching herself, running the studies by herself. That is a very potent signal, and it shows her sort of her grit, her determination, her ability to be autonomous, and all these other sort of, really high value intangibles that you want to be signaling. I've also mentioned in the past, you may found a club at your high school. Nobody shows up to the first meeting, right? Or shows up to one of your meetings, or there's some big hiccup. That's a really, great place to show and exercise your grit. A lot of students will just become very discouraged. They're very easy to basically, sort of break their will, right? They're smart and they have 1 out of 1,000 level intelligence, but they don't have 1 out of 1,000 level grit, or 1 out of 1,000 level pain tolerance, or 1 out of 1,000 level courage, right? And that basically becomes the constraint on their success. Not just in this process, but that will become the constraint on their success in life, right? Because if you lack perseverance, if you lack grit, if you lack courage, it doesn't matter eventually how smart you are, that becomes the constraint, right? So that becomes the weak link in the system. It is very important to know where you're trying to send these signals. And in your resume, in your essays, you don't want to sort of have the cliche adversity essay. There is a lot of opportunity in these other forums, these other domains to show your grittiness, to show the narrative, to show the overcoming potentially, to show you working through something where you're building a business and your resume and you're iterating through and the product's not working and it's still not working and it's still not working and you have to keep doing it over and over and over and over again. Not good to be showing that in terms of, again, your classes, your SAT. But really great if you are a student, you're building a business. It is hard. It is really freaking hard to run a business and to have a successful business. So that would be another example to sort of show how you're iterating through, the product or different strategies or whatever it is. It's basically understanding that grit, that perseverance, that ability to embrace challenge and difficulty is important, but knowing where to signal it and where not to signal it. And the academic index is not the appropriate place to be signaling it because that is the place where you're showing your innate ability, right? And innate doesn't mean like working really hard, right? In a lot of ways, it means basically like it looks like it comes to you like without a lot of difficulty, right? And as I'm sort of, mentioning this a little bit, I'm kind of thinking of, there's this very classic, in talking to parents a lot, they very often describe, the boy in the family or the son as the one who sort of, just sort of gets away with not doing very much and, still having very high grades, and the girl sort of is the one who, like, works really hard to get their grades, right? And I always prefer the student who works hard, like, that is, regardless of what admissions officers think, always prefer the person who, is a maximizer, right? They're not the person who's just trying to see what's the least amount of work that they can put in to get a 91 because it just has a lot of liabilities in the rest of their candidacy, right? It's certainly great to have students where they can just skate by, you don't have to really worry about the academic index. You can just focus, all of your time and attention on the resume building and the hook building. But the problem is a lot of those students who are very, for lack of a better word, lazy, or they're these optimizers, right? They're like trying to get the 89.5 with the least amount of work put in versus the person who's saying, I need to maybe even overstudy because I need to sort of mitigate the risk that I don't get a good, that I don't get a good grade on this test, right? Versus the student just doing the bare minimum. Always prefer the students, all else, equal, who basically is a maximizer and they're trying to do the most. They have that sort of whatever it takes mindset. But it's very funny because when you sort of think about this, whoever the students are, they could be in the same family. It might be reversed, right? This is just sort of the common one that you get. These are sort of some of the stereotypes of students. Again, in terms of the academic index, it would be better to be sending the signal of this comes much more effortlessly. And then when it comes to sort of your resume, your hook building outside the classroom, etc., this is a great forum, for conveying sort of your grit, your perseverance, particularly in the context of building your hook and your unique narrative, because that's really what is sort of projecting out to what you'll study in college, maybe it doesn't have to be what you'll do in life per se. And you do want to see that sort of grit, and that perseverance to sort of work through in that domain, regardless of what your innate ability is, right? And so that's the second signal, and it's more outside of the academic index, right? It's a more appropriate signal to be sending the grit, perseverance, the ability to handle adversity, more in the resume building, the hook building, and then potentially in that storytelling component in the application essays. Then we get to the third variable here, right? That you're trying to send to these colleges, right? And I'm going to sort of bring it all together with a sort of, I think, very clean visual. So the third one is focus. So focus is, or you can also call it commitment, right? And there are a lot of very smart students who just are not focused. There are a lot of very smart people who are not focused in life, right? And as I've said before, you might have 1,000 IQ, but if you chop your 1,000 IQ up in 28 different directions, it's not worth very much. It doesn't really matter how gifted or how talented or how smart you are if you're constantly distracted and your time is going into all different buckets. Somebody who's putting 100% in, but maybe has less ability than you is just going to kick your butt. It's just, it's just how it works. It's just math, right? So, and again, it's not an either or. We can now see how all these things come together. Innate ability, innate talent, right? You already have it to begin with. Then you're super gritty and you're super perseverant. You can endure difficulty, you can endure challenge, you can push past setbacks, and you're extremely focused. And the focus component is the one that's really what the hook in a lot of ways is meant to represent, right? Your admissions hook, this sort of very defined passion. We sort of say like it's a very, academically relevant passion, but you can, the great thing about this process and the news of students needing to have a hook to get into a top college, they're so agnostic with respect to what that hook is, right? It's such great news versus, decades ago where you have to be a well-rounded student, but it's like, what if you don't want to play an instrument and run track and be class president and be on the newspaper? It kind of sucks if you don't want to be well-rounded like that. I think it's actually great news that a lot of these colleges have for students nowadays, where they're basically saying, we don't care what the passion is. You can turn any passion that you have, right? You could love, making retro Smurf t-shirts and selling them to people, right? They don't care. They don't care. Just like the market. If you want to start a business, you want to be an entrepreneur, it doesn't matter, right? There's obviously going to be a total addressable market and the market's going to decide, but there are crazy weird niches that people occupy that are extremely valuable, right? I mean, you could sell arcade machines, you could sell stamps, you'd be a stamp collector, a coin. There's all these different weird niches of niches of niches, right? It just has to be valuable to someone and to an audience, right? And so it's great news that the colleges really don't care what the passion is. You just have to have a passion, right? But it could be basically anything. I think it's fantastic news nowadays that basically they're saying, hey, you just need to be really good at something and really passionate about something, but we don't really care what it is. We don't need to spread you thin. But there are definitely students who are very smart and they just are well-rounded, right? Like they just, it's like telling them they need to focus is like saying, hey, I need you to cut off, your left arm. I need you to cut off your right leg. And it's like very painful to them, right? And then there are other kids, and this is true people in life, where you're like, hey, like this is great. Like you really enjoy this thing. Let's just double down. Let's triple down. Let's 5X. Let's just do more. And they're like, that's amazing. I thought I had to do track. And you're like, no, it's pointless. If you want to go to a top college, like get rid of the track if you don't like it. Right? It's like the best possible news to them. And there are just these people in life, and there are, of course, if there are people in life who are like that, some people are very just naturally focused, and some people are just naturally very well-rounded, and they, are just easily distracted. They have a million different hobbies and avocations. You're going to end up with students as well, who are going to have, they're going to be on a spectrum and distribution in terms of the propensity towards well-roundedness versus sort of spikiness, so to speak. But at the end of the day, it's not a crazy secret that somebody who is more focused that shows more defined, precise passion for a certain area, is basically just able to put all their eggs in that basket and to invest all their resources, their attention, their time, their efforts, their energies. It's just it consumes you, right? It's just you're thinking about it all the time. You're trying to make it better, 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 better. You're doing more, 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 whatever it takes in that area. It's just a much better. It's just a much better signal for success in that domain. It's not an indictment of you as a person. You can live your life however you want to live your life. If you have your 18 hobbies and your gardening and your cooking and your whatever, whatever it is, your softball league, it's fine. It's just much less likely that you're going to be absolutely excellent or the best at any one of those things. I think that's very commonsensical. I'm not saying anything here that is people can sort of argue, well, like, it doesn't mean I'm a bad person. It's nothing to do with that. It's math at the end of the day, right? Somebody who's putting 100% of their attention and effort behind one singular pursuit and one singular focus is just much more likely, all else being equal, to succeed and to be a standout in that very, defined vertical in that area. That is the hook, right? That is why we talk a lot about, addition by subtraction, right? One of your biggest ROIs is just looking at the stuff in your candidacy or what your time is going towards and saying, hey, this is not the thing that I'm the best at or that I'm the most passionate about, this track or whatever it is. I could go do 4 times a week running for 30 minutes and it's 2 hours versus I'm on the track team and it's 20 hours, right? And this just is not a good ROI on my time, right? And so a lot of it is just addition by subtraction. You get rid of distractions. And, nobody likes to hear that they're not committed, right? But the best definition of commitment is that I've ever heard is the quantity and the quality of alternatives that you have eliminated. If something is really painful to get rid of, but you know you need to do it, commitment is getting rid of that alternative, right? And sort of bearing the brunt of it. Somebody who's willing to get rid of things that are more painful is more committed than somebody, who's not, right? And also somebody who's willing to get rid of a greater quantity of alternative commitments and distractions, things that are pulling their attention away from that main thing that they're the best at, they're the most passionate. Somebody who's willing to get rid of a greater quantity of those alternatives and those sort of distractions is more committed than the person who's not, or is only willing to get rid of maybe two, whereas the first person's maybe willing to get rid of six and just go all in. A lot of people want to sort of hear they want the label that they're committed and they're focused, right? People don't like to really hear that they're not focused or they're not committed, but they don't actually instantiate the behavior of what it actually looks like to be committed, right? Which is just the human condition in a nutshell, right? Most people want the label or they want the outcomes, but they want it their way, right? They want to go to one of these colleges or they want to be super successful, but they want to do it their way. They want somebody to tell them you're never going to have to give up Fridays or Saturdays or skip social events or get rid of the stupid track thing that's helping you optimize your goals. Everybody wants the outcomes, but they want it their way, right? And unfortunately, that's not how the world works. We have these 3 signals, right? Focus is your ability to identify what is your comparative advantage. What are you comparatively really good at? And what do you comparatively really enjoy? And that is your hook. That is what you're building your candidacy around, right? That is your through line. That's why we want to signal that focus in your applications. And when you look at, when we go through the application reviews, you'll see we're taking out a lot of this sort of fluff in there, right? Did JV soccer. I was a member of this club that has nothing to do with my hook. You're just diluting down the focus. You're diluting the through line. It's not clear what the hook is because, like, you keep diluting it with unimpressive stuff, unimpressive and irrelevant stuff. And that's towards the late stages, right? In the beginning stages, you're just wasting a bunch of time on these other distractions, right? You're not focused, right? And again, you could be super talented, you could have all the ability in the world, but if you don't have grit, if you don't have perseverance, if you don't have courage, if you don't have these intangibles, you can't push through difficulty and you can't focus, you're just not going to reach the same level as somebody else who has all of these attributes, right? And the colleges know it. So that's the last component. It's the focus, it's the hook, it's the willing to go all in, right? And people who are passionate about something, they don't have an issue going all in. They have more of an issue taking their time away from that thing, right? Because if you're actually really passionate about something, you don't need people to tell you to do more of it. If anything, people are gonna be, like, trying to drag you away from it. They're gonna be like, "You're obsessive, you're crazy, like, why do you spend so much time on that thing?" Like, you need to chill out. And so if you really have a passion, it should just make sense that you want to do more of it, more of it, more of it. And, that's what these colleges are looking for. They're looking for the students who can focus, they can really put a lot of their eggs in certain baskets. This doesn't have to just be one discipline. It is very strategic and very ideal for students to, be at the intersection of multiple disciplines. That doesn't mean you're not focused. Focus is not the same thing as just single discipline or being one dimensional. It's not, these are not the same things. So you can have, you can be at the intersection of two fields or maybe even three fields, as long as you're focused at that intersection or at the nexus point of that, right? Or maybe you have a few different activities and they're in these two different domains, but you could sort of bring them into a cohesive story and a cohesive whole. That doesn't mean you're lacking in focus, right? You have a focus, you're just using multiple disciplines in order to really best tackle certain challenges. They may be best tackled through multiple disciplinary tools. Okay, let's sort of zoom out here and look at sort of all three of these, basically, right? So, first signal you're trying to send to the colleges, just raw horsepower, intellectual promise, and ability. That comes mainly through the academic index, your grades, your course rigor, your testing, and at least in terms of what you show to the colleges, I'm not saying on the back end. And again, I don't really 100% agree that this is the way that admissions works, but it just is what it is. I still have a ton of respect for a student who has to, grit their way through, to get that A or that A plus in Calc BC. And it was maybe even harder for them than it was for another student. Like I think there's still a lot of respect owed to that student who does the tutoring. They go to the office hours, they study preemptively over the summer before they go into the challenging course, and they put in the extra work to sort of, again, mitigate the risk that they get off to a bad start at the beginning of the school year. I think that student deserves a lot of respect, and I think that we can see why that's a great sign of being successful in life in general. It's just your ability, your work ethic, right? However, that's back end, right? If you did all that stuff, you did the tutoring, it was really hard, your grades were lower, you had to pull them up, you had to go to extra office hours, that's fine, just don't show it to the colleges, right? That academic index is not the place for showing your grit. Please, for heaven's sake, do not have one of your teachers talk about the adversity story of how low your grade was in AP Lit and how you brought it up finally to an A at the end of the year because they would have never known that otherwise, right? Do not do that. Do not send them 12 SAT or ACT scores. That is your intellectual, your academic promise. It's much more closely related to your innate talent and ability. Those are the vehicles through which you send that signal is, again, through those academic index, and sort of measurements and metrics that we typically know and we tend to traditionally associate with intellectual promise and academic ability. Second signal is basically your grit, your determination, your ability to overcome setbacks, go through adversity. That is best signaled, as are many intangibles, through your resume, your hook building. Again, it could be iterating for a product in your business, have the difficulty of founding a club, the difficulty of, a research project with a professor and all the setbacks there potentially, whatever it is, right? Don't fall into like the just total cliche, adversity. It's not easy to sort of convey some of these things because they can be a bit of a cliche. But just understanding that if you're gonna send that signal, and it is a good signal to potentially send, it goes in a different place, right? It's more in the resume, that side of things, and that can be part of your narrative in your application and your essays. And then the third signal that they're looking for that you should be optimally trying to send is your ability to focus and to commit, right? And that is your hook. It's your ability to be very introspective, very reflective. Look at the evidence, not just what you say, but what you actually do. What are you comparatively better at? What is your comparative advantage? What's your unfair advantage? Right? And so, one way that I like to sort of operationalize this for students, if I'm talking to a student, and they're doing an interview for a program, one thing that I'll ask them is, if you had to compete on in one domain, right? This is sort of like, if you don't, like you need to beat as many people as you possibly can at this one task. Otherwise, you never see your family again, right? There's some like very high stakes consequence. What would you pick? Right? And you're sort of trying to get to what are they really the best at? And then there's another version of this, which is if I said you need to get rid of everything else, everything. You can't do anything else for the next 3 years, or you can take the extreme version, which is like the entire rest of your life. And we're talking about like a whole bunch of things that the student does, possible areas for, how they're going to sort of build their resume and their hook. You can take the 3-year version, the 4-year version, or the 2, whatever it is, however long they have until they apply to college, or you could just take the very extreme version, which is just like, you can never do anything else for the rest of your life. What would you pick? Right? And that sort of gets to the passion component. The first one sort of gets to operationalizing sort of the talent or sort of your comparative advantage from a talent perspective. The second question gets more towards, sort of operationalizing or sort of making concrete, sort of what you're the most passionate about or what you would enjoy doing the most, because you're literally saying you would need to get rid of everything else, right? I'm not saying you literally, absolutely, but it's a thought experiment. That's the focus. It's that hook, and it's being able to, basically go all in and to eliminate other commitments, and basically to put your eggs into this basket, and make sure that all of your ability, your potential, your talent, your grit, your ability to overcome all the other things that we talked about are going towards a singular pursuit, and they're not going all over the place, and you're not becoming just distracted, right? And so I want to sort of pull it all together, with a very neat visual. Before I get into that, I think this just makes a lot of sense, right? If you were talking about an athlete, for example, you would want to pick the athlete who has, if they're a basketball player, they have the height, they have the 48-inch, vertical jump, whatever those sort of, NFL combine, the 40 time, you would want it all, right? Now, you can't always get it all, right? Somebody who had it all would just be like a totally next level or once in a generation level, prospect. They'd be the one who had all the measurables, they have all the talent, they have all the ability, they have the arm where they could throw the ball 80 yards, right, from their knees or whatever it is, right? Or they get the 48-inch vertical, et cetera, right? They would have the talent, they would have the ability, but then they would also ideally have the work ethic, right? They would also have other critical intangibles like leadership. They don't blame their teammates, in front of the press, when the wide receiver drops the ball. Patrick Mahomes isn't saying, calling out the wide receiver and making them look bad, in front of the media, right? They would have these other really important intangibles. And as I said, sort of that grit, that perseverance is first and foremost among those intangibles. And then they would be focused. They're professional athletes, right? If we're talking about an athlete at any high level, even if you're just a recruited athlete for college, or you just want to be a very, very good at whatever level you're playing this thing, but certainly professional or Olympian, et cetera, you're not going to also be a professional soccer player and a professional baseball player and a professional hockey. It's just like you can't. And this becomes your life. This becomes the preponderance of your life. You spend time recovering in the ice bath. You spend time in the sauna. You spend time lifting weights. You spend time practicing. You spend time at the games. You spend time for the personal trainers, for the coaches. You then need rest and recovery, right? You need to get adequate sleep. You need to eat a certain amount of protein. This becomes your life. For the person where it's not their life, who's very distracted, right? You're just not going to beat the person who's focused, all else being equal. And so I think we get it in that sort of context, right? It's very sensical, and that would be true of not just athletes, but it would be true of a whole bunch of other work domains as well, right? And it's also true of admissions. And that's what they're looking for because, again, these are not, this is nothing to do with college admissions, right? It's just these are already predictors of success, innate ability and promise and talent, stacked with amazing grit and perseverance, stacked with exceptional commitment and focus. That person's probably going to be very successful no matter what they do. It doesn't have anything to do with college admissions. So again, going back to what I said, it's the signal, it's these traits that they are already selecting for and recruiting for, and a lot of people have it wrong. They're worried about what they get in terms of the acceptances. Whereas if you just could embody these traits, you would already have a very high probability of success in the first place. You're looking at it the wrong way. And so a lot of the way that we approach, and the reason, I approach the process this way, our team approaches the process this way, is let's build the traits. Let's work on the traits. Let's work on the becoming, not the getting. Let's try to become that person who has 1 out of 1,000 level courage, one out of 1,000 level perseverance, 1 out of 1,000 level grit, and ability to overcome setbacks. Let's not try to just go to an Ivy League school and try to arbitrage our way with 1 out of 2 level courage, because life will put pressure on that constraint regardless. The Ivy label is not going to save you from the fact that you don't have exceptional courage or grit or ability to overcome adversity and challenge. It is just understanding that these signals, the domains in which they're looking for the signals, I don't even necessarily like myself. Again, I think a student who has to work quite hard and they're willing to work very hard, to get that A or that A plus, in the AP class, whereas maybe it comes much more natural to another student, or you have to take the SAT, however many times, you take it 4 times to hit a 1560, where somebody else could take it once and hit a 1560. I don't really, to me, I think there's just tremendous respect for anybody who's willing to work really hard, but the colleges do have a little bit of that sort of where they wanna sort of see certain signals and certain traits in what sort of context or where the signals are coming from, right? But that being said, those signals at a fundamental level are just predictive of success, right? And the final visual that I wanna sort of lead off with here, I came up with it, so of course I'm biased. I'm gonna think that it's a compelling visual. The visual that I really like here is if you were, charged with bringing down a really huge tree. And so I handed you an axe, and this is a, like, behemoth of a tree. Really hard to bring down. The way that I sort of visualize this is your ability is basically how sharp the axe is. You could maybe take a different analog here and maybe say it's like how hard, like how powerful you are, how strong, but actually like the sharpness of the axe. I actually think it works the best in this analogy. That is how sharp the axe is, right? That's sort of your, and we even sort of describe sort of academic prowess or intellectual ability in terms of, sort of like acumen, acuteness, like sharpness, right? Like mental sharpness, right? So it's good, in terms of that as well, for this visual. So that's how sharp the axe is, right? It's like what your innate ability or potential is, or talent or giftedness, in a given area, right? Then, you might have a sharp axe, but like, if you hit the tree trunk, like 5 times, 6 times, 100 times, and it's still not working, it doesn't matter. Like, it doesn't matter. And again, there are a bunch of students who are very smart, but they lack grit and perseverance, right? We're so quick to put them on a pedestal and call them gifted and talented, but they don't have a lot of grit, right? And in fact, the label of calling them gifted and talented actually works as a detriment in a lot of ways to their grit. We've known students at certain high schools across the country where this is the culture of the high school. It's basically, look at me, look at how little I have to try. there's like almost academic bullying for like bullying kids who have to try harder. It's like looking down. And so what happens is people don't get better because they don't ask a question because they're so worried about looking not super smart or not coming across as gifted or talented. You could have the sharpest axe in the world, but if you can't keep banging on that tree, you're not going to bring it down. And you see this all the time with students. It's like, great, you're 1 out of 1,000 levels smart, but you don't have the necessary grit. And so you will just give up. It's just a matter of time. You will just eventually give up. And there's some student out there, they will never give up. And so they will literally never fail. And they might not be smart. They may be like not smart at all, right? But they will never give up, right? So it's just like, who are you going to bet on? Somebody who has all of the innate ability and potential, but like will give up on the 10th rep or the 100th or whatever. Like they will give up. Like it is known they will give up versus the person who's like, oh, I'll just keep doing this basically forever. That is another constraint. And so you can have the sharpest axe. If you don't keep swinging it, not going to necessarily matter, right? And so your grit, your perseverance, your ability to overcome setbacks and challenges, that is just how many times like you will swing the axe, right? It's just, can you swing it again, 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 again? And that is just, can you beat on your craft, right? Or whatever it is. Can you keep working on it, working on it, working on it, iterating, whatever it takes, whatever it takes, whatever it takes. I've recently called this like not my phrase, but I was mentioning this recently, is the open till goal mindset, right? A lot of people is, I'm open until 5 p.m., 9 to 5. I'm open until 5 p.m. I'm open until 7 p.m. I'm open until, whatever, right? Whereas the best people are open until it gets done. It's a lot of the most elite athletes. It's, until I make 500 shots, I'll shoot the ball as many times as necessary until I get this number of specified outcomes, right? And I won't leave the gym until I've made 500 shots. If it takes me however many shots, then I'll just do it as many times as I need to because that's the goal and that's the objective, right? So whatever it takes mentality. Most people don't have a whatever it takes mentality, which is why most people, by definition, are not at the top of their field. That's basically, again, just swinging the axe as many times as you possibly need. And if you're just banging on your craft, you're banging on your passion as many times as it takes, you are much more likely to be successful. And so that's the grit, that's the determination, that's the perseverance, right? Combined with how sharp it is, right? And then the focus is if you're swinging the axe and you're hitting the tree every single time you swing the axe, right? You're hitting it in a different direction. Somebody walks by you and they're like, hey, hey, can you help me with the newspaper, thing that column that I need or whatever for my thing? Hey, could you come out on Friday night? I need you to, hey, I need you to do this. Hey, I need you to do that. Hey, I need this. Hey, here's the Instagram distraction. Here's the TikTok distraction. Here's the track that's 20 hours a week, right? And it's just like, you don't even know where you were, hitting the thing. Like you're just hitting the tree in a million different places, right? And you're not making any progress because the person who's going to make progress just keeps hitting the tree in the same exact spot. So they have the sharpest axe, they will hit it forever, and they will hit the same spot forever. Those are your three signals. Those are your three traits, right? Promise, focus, and absolute grit and determination. That person very likely is going to bring down the tree. Bringing it back, that is what these top colleges are after. They're not after it because this is some quirk of gamesmanship or some just weird anomaly, right? This is just, just so I can go to an Ivy League school or just so I can go to wherever it is, right? No, it's much more fundamental. It's much deeper than that. These are traits that predict success. And when you have them in combination with each other, they are an extremely potent force and combination. And they are the traits that most people who are the absolute best in their fields, they are the traits that they tend to possess. Okay, that is it for this episode. Hopefully this was helpful in terms of just sort of walking through what at a fundamental level are you trying to show to these colleges? Where are you trying to show it in terms of your candidacy? And certainly some other mindset and bigger picture stuff in terms of, again, this notion that these are not arbitrary traits. And one of the best mindsets that you can possibly have for this process is trying to not just be so externally focused and so externally minded on just the accolades. You have to obviously have an eye towards the strategy of the process, and even the most intrinsically driven people still, of course, are still aware of the accolades and the finish line and, who won the game and the scoreboard and the medals and et cetera, et cetera. There still is going to be extrinsic pressures, and there's still pressures placed on you by virtue of the fact that you're competing against other people. There are strategic factors, and there are gamesmanship elements, but at a fundamental level, what you want to do more than anything is you want to become the type of person that these top colleges are after, because it is in and of itself valuable for the rest of your life, because again, they are choosing traits that already are very well known in terms of predicting success. That's it. And we'll talk soon in the next episode. Bye bye.